Okay, hi. I'm pretty sure this is recording. This is my third time recording this because I've had issues with Canvas Studio. So I'm also forewarning you that I have COVID. I don't know who all is watching this, but um, just gonna forewarn you if my voice sounds groggy or anything. So there is that. All right, so my language is Portuguese, and we're gonna go over the linguistics elements of Portuguese. So let's get right into it. So introducing Portuguese, we'll start off. Why did I choose this language? So I actually knew that Portuguese was almost pretty mutually intelligible. I know that pretty much every Portuguese speaker can understand Spanish. When I actually got my first tattoo, my tattoo artist was from Brazil and spoke Spanish with me so that we could understand each other because his English wasn't all that great. So I've always loved it. I love how it sounds. It sounds so unique. I feel like it doesn't sound like how I always expected it to when I was learning pronunciation. But some fast facts. So there are approximately 250 million native Portuguese speakers worldwide, and Portuguese was developed from Latin spoken by Roman soldiers and the colonists back in the 3rd century BC, and that's where its earliest forms can be found. And it's a Romance language from the Indo-European language family, and so many other Romance languages also are, like English and Spanish. And it's the fastest growing European language behind English, so that's pretty cool. So difficult aspects of Portuguese, the most difficult aspect would probably be phonetics and phonology because Portuguese is not a phonetic language, which means that you can't really read a sentence and know exactly how to pronounce everything from that sentence. So that makes it a little bit tricky. Spanish is really good about being phonetic. English also is not. So there are also many diacritics in written Portuguese, and those are like the little accent marks, little dots above letters, like help kind of explain how you're going to pronounce that letter. And another difficult thing is that we have to think about both European and Brazilian Portuguese differences when it comes to pronunciation because it's not the same, and I'll get into that a bit later. And there are lots of tedious rules regarding the pronunciation of consonants, which I soon found out, along with vowels too. So that is probably the most difficult aspect that I was not expecting, is pronunciation for sure. And then another difficult aspect is that verb formation and conjugations can take time because there are so many. So next, let's get right into Portuguese morphology. So a typical verb can take on 50 forms. So we're going to talk about the verb fazer. It can also be pronounced fazer, and it primarily means to do or to make, similar to hacer in Spanish. And in the you, like the to form, if I were to say you do in Portuguese, I would say fazes or fazes. So that's an example of conjugation. So there are 6 grammatical tenses: present, present progressive, present and past perfect, preterite and perfect future, and also conditional, which I forgot to put in here. And there are 3 moods: the subjunctive, imperative, and indicative, that rely heavily in correlation with those tenses, as we know. And then number and person, so there are 2 numbers, singular and plural, and there are 3 persons within those singular and plural sections, first, second, and third. And then I provided this little Wikipedia, what's that? It's a table with that verb conjugation for fazer, fazes, and it kind of shows like the first, second, and third conjugations that are within that singular. So if we're talking about he, she, it, that's fazer, that's faz, and me, that's fato, and we can see what I already said, fazes. Those are all one singular person, and then you can see the plurals from right below that. So for gender and number, Portuguese is gendered. The basic pattern for the masculine nouns are o and os, and basic pattern for feminine nouns are a and as. So the feminine nouns, I gave some examples, were casa, mala, and for masculine nouns we have cajo and saco. And then the rule that I kind of just told you is not super foolproof because there are words that are both feminine and masculine but don't follow that ending, and those are considered irregular cases. Thinking about gender and number together. So in the sentence, tenemos tres gatos lindos, gato is masculine and uses the os ending because we're speaking about three of that noun, which is gato, and it's masculine. All right, and affixes are derivational morphemes, so they change the meaning of the initial word, and we have suffixes and prefixes that I'm going to be talking about. So the ending menche is actually equated, I think the direct translation is very in English, and then you also have the ending isima, which is a superlative, meaning like the most or the best of something. And then the other suffix is sao, which indicates an ongoing process, similar to like tion in English. And we can see that same ending in the next example, which I have readaptação, which means readaptation, Portuguese, and it also has a prefix of re, which indicates repetition. Another example of a prefix is in, which indicates negation, similar to un and in English as well. And so an example of a word with that prefix is infeliz, which means unhappy, I'm sure as you can tell. So moving into Portuguese syntax. So Portuguese is generally an SVO language. There are some cases with SOV, but it's pretty primarily SVO. And an example of this structure can be seen in the sentence, Maria adora livraria, which means Maria loves the bookstore. And you can see Maria is the subject, loves the verb, and the bookstore is the object. Another interesting thing about Portuguese is that it is a null subject language, which means that the subject is not always explicit. It's not necessary. And I said, what, how? Because I feel like we hear that and we're like, wait, what? Because in English, if we were to just say things without including a subject, we'd be like, wait, what? Like, what are you talking about? Or who are you talking about? But I'll give you an example. The reason this is okay is because of inflection in the verb. That's okay in Spanish too. And because English lacks that inflection right within the verbs, that's why it tends to freak us out. But for example, in Portuguese, you can say está chovendo, or you can say ele está chovendo, and ele means he, which is referring to the weather, so that would be the explicit subject, but ele is not necessary to be understood because we know that subject. It's indicated by está, and also because we know that rain comes from the weather. All right, so adjectives and adverbs. So adjectives go behind the noun they're modifying in Portuguese, which is not similar to English. So, for example, in this little phrase, campos verdes, this is green fields, and we can see that verdes comes after campos, so it modifies the fields. And this is similar to many other Romance languages, Spanish, I think Italian too, don't quote me, but it's usually common to have adjectives behind the noun that they're modifying. So adverbs work similarly to English. So in the end of adverbs in English, we have ly, like in the example I say quickly. And this can be equated to the Portuguese ending of mente, or suffix of mente. And so I have the example of the word rapidamente, which means quickly, and it's the mente part is modifying the initial word, which is rápida, or rápida, sorry. And we can see that that is similar to how the ly modifies the word quick in English. So much of Portuguese grammar relies heavily on context, inflection, and conjugations. So that is something that's really important to remember. I kind of talked about that a little bit earlier with the inflection and understanding, because it's the subjects in the inflection. And Yeah, so Portuguese phonetics and phonology. So for phonetics in Portuguese, diacritics are used to help distinguish pronunciation, and they're really useful. I'm going to talk about the distinction of pronunciation between Portuguese and English with consonants specifically, and I'll get into vowels a little bit too. But if the letter C in Portuguese is followed by A, O, or U, then it sounds like K, like in the word in English culture. But if the C is followed by E or I, then it sounds like S, like in the Portuguese word centro. Um, for the letter G, if it's followed by the letters A, O, or U, then it sounds like G. But if it's followed by E or I, then it sounds like J, like in the word genre, the English word genre. And the letter J always sounds like J in Portuguese. The letter H is silent, like in the word ora. And then we're going to talk about vowels. So there's an open A that sounds like A, like in parte, and there is a closed A, which sounds like the schwa in English, like in America, America. There's an open and closed E, and there are lots of others that I quite frankly don't have time for in this pronunciation or in this presentation because they're just a lot. They have a huge phonetic inventory. Portuguese phonetics and phonology. Now, we're going to talk about phonology. So dialects roughly are split into urban and rural. We do that in America too. There are different dialectal situations between rural and urban areas. So the differences between EP and BP, specifically in EP, which is European Portuguese, vowel reduction and deletion is practiced pretty often. So, for example, in the verb depenicar, which means to pluck in English, Brazilian Portuguese pronounces it like I just did, but EP pronounces it sort of, this is going to be difficult to do, but like depenicar, like kind of skipping over those vowels and, deleting them. And then for addition, both EP and BP practice the addition of vowels, breaking most two obstruent consonant sequences, like in the word psychology in English, and in Portuguese it's pronounced psicologia. It's pronounced differently in both sections, but both added either the I or the I sound for that. For phonotactic reasons. We do that in English too. If it's easier on the tongue, then we do it, and that's easier because of those consonant sequences to split it up with a vowel. And finally, to the conclusion. So the biggest differences between English and Portuguese would have to be the phonology and phonetics, which I discussed, the use of diacritics too, and the way adjectives are used in Portuguese. That's obviously not the same to English. We flipped this sequence around. And English is also not a gendered language primarily, and Portuguese obviously is, along with many other Romance languages. But English is a V2 language, and Portuguese is SVO. And what a V2 language is basically in sentences, the verb is almost exclusively the second part. So it's nice that Portuguese is SVO because that's so similar to us. And Portuguese also borrows words from English because English is a massive lingua franca. So that is helpful when learning too, if you don't have to learn as many words. And our vocabulary is reflected in Portuguese vocab too. And learning Portuguese from English is not as hard as it seems, especially if you have a language like Spanish under your belt too. Me researching it was even easier for me to understand because I had that background of Spanish, so it's helpful when learning about Portuguese. So learning languages is seriously so amazing. I can't stress it enough. I love it so much, and it really opens your mind and helps change your perspective. I don't know if anyone is watching this besides Professor Gocham, but if someone is, then I really suggest learning more languages, or at least trying to understand more cultures than just ours. It's pretty amazing. So thanks for sticking with me. Hopefully the COVID didn't make it too bad, but that's the end of my presentation. I'll see you later.